It was well past midnight when the first sound reached me. A single creak, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence of my house as though the darkness itself had shifted its weight. At first, I dismissed it as the natural settling of timber, the weary groan of beams holding back the pressure of years. Yet something about it felt pointed, purposeful, as though it had waited for the precise moment my body slipped into fragile rest before speaking. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat, straining to hear again. The silence pressed heavily against my ears, an almost physical weight. Then came the second creak, longer this time, dragging across the ceiling above me, like a hesitant step taken on old boards. My heart clenched. That sound had not come from the walls, nor from the floor of another room. Came from the attic. The attic had always unsettled me, though I could never fully explain why. Perhaps it was its position, looming directly above my bedroom like a hidden presence that never slept. Or perhaps it was the way the hatch door blended too well into the ceiling, its outline barely visible, as though the house itself wished me never to look too closely. In daylight, I ignored it, dismissing it as storage space for forgotten boxes and broken furniture. But at night, I could feel it pressing down, as though something within crouched just beyond the thin barrier of plaster and wood. The third creak was softer, but closer, right above the bed where I lay. My body stiffened. A cold sweat began to bead across my forehead, soaking into the pillow beneath me. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the weight of the attic ceiling lowered inch by inch with each sound. I dared not move. The silence stretched once more, heavy and unbroken, save for the pounding of my pulse in my ears. I clung to the explanation of rodents, convincing myself it was nothing more than rats scurrying across beams, gnawing through forgotten insulation. Yet even as I whispered that lie to myself, I knew no rat could tread with such deliberation. This was not the erratic scuffle of small creatures. It was the careful measure of something larger, something aware. The wind outside howled, rattling the loose panes of my window, but the noises above ignored the storm's rhythm, moving with their own dreadful pace. Another step, another creak, closer now to the attic hatch. I found myself staring at the faint square outline in the ceiling, barely visible in the dark, half expecting it to swing downward and spill its secret into the room. I wanted to move, to rise, to flee the confines of my bed, but the paralysis of dread held me. My limbs refused to obey, as though the weight of the house itself pressed me into the mattress. The only part of me that moved was my breath, shallow and ragged, betraying the fear I tried so desperately to still. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The sounds subsided, leaving me in silence once again. But the silence was worse. It was not relief but expectation, the kind of silence that waits. Just as my eyelids began to burn with the strain of staring upward, there came a new sound, one that froze the blood in my veins. A slow, dragging scratch. It began at one end of the attic and scraped its way across the ceiling, directly above me, as though sharp nails were tracing the outline of where I lay. It was patient, deliberate, a sound meant not to happen but to be heard. My breath caught. The hairs along my arms rose in unison. And with a sickening clarity, I realized the attic was not simply a space for storage. It was occupied. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving the silence heavier than before. Then came the final blow to what little calm I had clung to. From the dark above, muffled but distinct, I heard the sound of breathing. Not mine, not the storm's. A low, steady breath, measured and slow, seeping through the boards, as though whatever lurked above had pressed its mouth to the floor and was listening. And in that moment, I knew with unshakable certainty. I was not alone in my house. The morning brought no peace, only a fragile pretense of safety. Sunlight crept through the curtains, painting familiar patterns across the floor, yet my mind remained shackled to the night's sounds. I told myself it had been a dream, or perhaps the restless shifting of old beams stirred by the storm. But the marks of fear do not fade so easily. They linger, carved deep into the body. My eyes betrayed me constantly, drifting upward to the ceiling, searching for the outline of the attic door as if it might reveal something in broad daylight. For hours I avoided the thought of climbing up. I busied myself with meaningless chores, cleaning already spotless counters, rearranging books, scrubbing dishes that were not dirty. But the silence overhead stalked me. Every time the house settled, every time a floorboard groaned, I froze, my ears straining for the sound of nails against timber. The attic seemed to hum with its own life, quiet yet aware, waiting. It was not until late afternoon, when the weight of curiosity had become unbearable, that I found myself standing beneath the hatch. Dust clung thick to its edges, undisturbed by hands for years. The pull cord dangled just above my reach, like a baited snare. My hand rose, trembled, but fell away before touching it. I was not yet ready, not while daylight still clung weakly to the windows. That night, I returned to my bed with dread nesting deep in my chest. Sleep came in fragments, restless and shallow, my body jerking awake at every groan of the house. Midnight crept close, and with it came the sound I had both expected and dreaded, the scratch. It began faint, as though testing, a subtle drag across the boards above my head. My body tensed immediately, every nerve tuned to that single sound. The scratch paused, then resumed, longer this time, more insistent. I stared at the ceiling, my eyes locked on the attic hatch as though my gaze alone might hold it shut. The noise grew bolder, stretching from one end of the attic to the other, a slow, deliberate movement that made the skin crawl across my arms. It was not the random scurry of an animal. It was measured, patient, as if mapping the shape of the room below. Then it stopped, right above my bed. The silence that followed was unbearable. My breath quickened, shallow and uneven. My chest ached with the effort of remaining still. And then came the sound that forced my heart into my throat. Tap. Gentle, deliberate, a single knock against the boards above me. I froze, my body stiff as wood. Another tap followed. Then another, each separated by a pause, each perfectly timed.
Top.
Pause.
Top.
Pause. Like a hand knocking on a door. Like a signal. I wanted to scream, to leap from the bed and flee the room. But my body betrayed me, paralyzed by terror. I lay there in silence, counting the knocks until they ceased. The attic returned to stillness, yet the silence did not comfort me. It smothered me, pressed against my chest until I could scarcely breathe. I thought perhaps it was over. Perhaps the thing above had grown bored, retreating back into whatever dark corner it crawled from. But just as my eyes began to blur with exhaustion, the sound returned, far worse than before. The scratching was no longer a line traced across the ceiling. It was circling, round and round, directly above my bed, as though something crawled on hands and knees, tracing a ring into the boards. Faster, sharper, more frenzied. The sound filled the room until my head rang with it. And then silence. I dared not move, dared not even blink. My ears strained, desperate for the faintest clue of what came next. The attic hatch creaked. Only a fraction, just enough for a single breath of stale, cold air to spill into the room. And in that air, soft and low, I heard it. A whisper. My name. Morning light never felt so cruelly indifferent. It poured into my room as though the night had not happened, as though the whisper of my name had been a fabrication of exhausted nerves. But my body knew better. The tension in my muscles, the heaviness in my chest, and the raw ache in my throat from silent gasps told me I had not dreamed. Something had spoken, something that should not have. The air in my bedroom felt thicker, staler, clinging to me like the weight of damp cloth. I forced myself up, my limbs trembling under the weight of another sleepless night. I avoided looking at the attic hatch, though I could feel its presence looming overhead. It had cracked open. I was certain of it. Yet in the daylight, it sat flush with the ceiling once more, unmoved, as though mocking me for my fear. I knew I could not ignore it any longer. My thoughts circled endlessly, each conclusion dragging me to the same place. The attic. The idea of entering it made bile rise in my throat, but the alternative, lying helpless beneath it each night, was unbearable. I told myself I would only look, only lift the hatch enough to shine a torch inside. I would not step foot on those boards. Not yet. By afternoon I had found the courage, or rather the desperation. I fetched the stepladder from the shed and positioned it beneath the hatch. Dust fell in faint clouds as I tugged the cord. The hinges groaned in protest, and a gust of air spilled downward, stale, suffocating, reeking of age. It was not the neutral smell of wood and insulation. It was heavy, sour, almost damp, like the breath of something long sealed away. Torch in hand, I lifted the hatch fully, the ladder creaking beneath my weight. Darkness greeted me, thick and unbroken, swallowing the weak beam of light. Dust motes swirled, disturbed by the intrusion, dancing like tiny specters in the glow. The air pressed against my lungs, each breath shallow, as though the attic itself resented my presence. The light swept across boxes stacked in uneven towers, their surfaces furred with dust and cobwebs. Old trunks leaned against the beams, their locks rusted, their corners gnawed by time. Yet it was not the sight of forgotten relics that unsettled me most. It was the silence. The attic did not sound like an empty space. It was too still, too attentive. My every movement, the shift of a boot on the ladder rung, the rustle of my clothes, seemed amplified, yet nothing echoed back. It felt less like a room and more like a held breath. I wanted to retreat, to shut the hatch and pretend the exploration had been enough. But then I noticed something in the dust. Lines. Long, shallow grooves carved across the boards. They stretched in jagged patterns, circling one another like a maze. Some trailed all the way to the hatch itself, stopping just short of the opening. My pulse thundered. These were no accidents of storage. They were marks, deliberate, repeated, as if something with claws had paced these boards for years, dragging its nails through the wood in endless, restless circles. The torch flickered. My grip tightened. I swept the light towards the far corner, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement. A shape pulling back into the shadows, too fast to be clear. My chest seized, the air in the attic thickening further, pressing harder into my lungs. Then came the sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. A breath. Not mine. Not the house's. From deep within the attic, hidden by boxes and beams, came a slow exhale, rattling with age and dust. It seeped into the air around me, carrying with it the unmistakable impression of something aware. I froze, the torch beam trembling in my hand, its circle of light jittering across boxes and rafters. The silence after that breath was unbearable, weighted with expectation, as though it waited for me to speak, to move, to acknowledge it. I could not. My body recoiled, my heart clamoring for escape. In one desperate motion, I slammed the hatch shut and stumbled down the ladder, nearly toppling it in my haste. I stood gasping in the hallway, my throat raw, the taste of dust still heavy on my tongue. The attic was no longer a place of forgotten belongings. It was alive. It had lungs. It breathed, and it had waited far too long to be noticed. The hatch stayed closed, but the thought of what breathed above me poisoned every corner of the house. No room felt safe, no wall thick enough to guard me. It was as though the attic's breath had spilled down into the air I lived in, invisible and invasive, a reminder that the house was not mine alone. That night I lingered in the sitting room, forcing myself to stay awake with the drone of the television. Every creak of the beams made my head jerk upward. Every shifting shadow in the corners of my sight sent a prickle racing down my arms. I told myself I would not sleep, that I would resist the lure of the bed beneath the ceiling that hid it. But weariness is merciless. It drags the strongest resolve down into its tide. At some hour past midnight, the faint rhythm of sound began. At first it was subtle, almost soothing, the house murmuring as it cooled under the weight of the night. Then the pattern emerged. Too measured, too steady. Footsteps. They moved across the ceiling with dreadful calm, pacing the length of the attic. The sound pressed through the beams, each step slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever walked above wanted me to hear. My body tensed, rooted to the chair, my breath shallow as my eyes fixed upon the ceiling. The steps reached the far end of the attic, then stopped. Silence spread, smothering. I prayed it had ended, that the stillness was final. But then the sound began again, this time returning. Each footfall was heavier now, sharper against the boards, closing the distance back toward the hatch above the hallway. I could not bear it. The thought of remaining beneath that thing, listening helplessly as it moved, was worse than the fear of confronting it. Torch in hand, I forced myself into the corridor, my legs weak, trembling under the weight of dread. The ceiling groaned above as the footsteps shifted to follow me. They mirrored my path, shadowing my steps with perfect precision. When I stopped, so did they. When I moved again, they resumed. It was not random wandering. It was pursuit. I froze in the center of the hall, my chest seizing. Slowly, with hands that shook violently, I raised the torch toward the attic hatch. The beam fell across the edges of the panel, where the faintest line of dust drifted down, disturbed. Something waited just beyond, aware of me, standing in silence, as though poised to press its weight against the hatch and spill downward. The quiet stretched unbearably long, until at last the footsteps resumed, but not as before. No longer steady, no longer measured. They broke into a frantic run, racing from one side of the attic to the other, pounding across the boards in a frenzy. The noise filled the house, shaking the walls, rattling the air. It was chaos above, as though 100 feet trampled in unison. And then, in an instant, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the thunder before it. I held my breath, heart racing so violently I feared it might betray me. The floorboard above my head groaned, slowly, reluctantly, as though something had placed its full weight upon it. Another step followed, closer to the hatch. The sound was unbearable in its clarity, the slow descent of pressure from a foot dragging across wood. Step by step, it crept toward the door that separated us, each groan a warning, until it stopped directly above me. The wood strained. The hatch shifted ever so slightly, a faint creak that sent every nerve in my body screaming for escape. And then, in the suffocating stillness, came the sound that shattered all hope it might be imagination. A hand, fingers drumming gently on the wood, tapping in slow, deliberate rhythm. Not the scuttle of rats, not the scratching of claws. A hand, alive, aware, knocking from the other side of the ceiling. And it was waiting for me to answer. The tapping haunted me long after it stopped, echoing inside my head as though the wood itself had absorbed the sound and was replaying it in cruel repetition. I did not answer it. I could not. Instead, I fled back into the sitting room, torch clutched like a weapon, and waited for dawn. Yet when morning came, the ceiling above was silent, and the hatch once again lay flush, concealing its secrets. But the quiet was no comfort. It was a challenge. Something had followed me across the attic floor, mirrored my steps, pressed its weight into the boards above my head. Something had tapped with fingers instead of claws. And the attic, my attic, hid it. The longer I sat with that knowledge, the more unbearable it became. I could not live beneath it any longer, not without knowing what else waited in the dust and shadows above. So, with a resolve that tasted more of desperation than bravery, I climbed the ladder again that afternoon. The air that spilled from the attic was colder now, as though the boards themselves held the chill of night. Dust swirled around me in reluctant clouds, and the torch beam once more cut through the thick dark. The marks on the floor were still there, clawed trails circling endlessly, but it was something beyond them that drew my eye this time. A stack of boxes leaned heavily against the far wall, their cardboard softened by damp, their lids sagging under decades of weight. They looked ordinary at first, the kind of forgotten clutter any attic might hold. Yet the dust lay strangely upon them, swept aside in patches, disturbed as though something had brushed against their sides again and again. I pushed forward, each step on the boards sending a groan rippling into the silence. The torch shook faintly in my grip, and the dust beneath my boots stirred into restless spirals. When I reached the boxes, I pressed my shoulder into the top one, shifting it aside with a grunt. The movement revealed what I had not expected. A seam in the wall. Not brick, not beam, but wood thin planks fitted poorly together, their edges darkened with age and neglect. It was a door, narrow and uneven, hidden behind the clutter. Its outline was only just visible, and at its center was a rusted iron latch, corroded by years yet still intact. My breath caught. The attic had been built with a secret, a second space, a place concealed deliberately, walled away from sight. The air around it was different, staler, heavier, as though what lay beyond had not been touched by the living in a very long time. My torchlight flickered across the wood, and in that unsteady glow I saw faint scratches around the latch. Not fresh, but deep, desperate grooves, as though hands, human or otherwise, had clawed at it from the inside. My stomach tightened, and for a moment I considered retreating. The sensible thing would have been to shut the hatch, burn the ladder, and never return. But the attic had already stripped me of peace. Each night it grew bolder, pressing closer, demanding I listen. If I did not open this door, I knew it would never let me go. With trembling hands, I reached for the latch. The iron bit cold into my fingers, flaking with rust as I tugged. At first it resisted, as though fused by time, but with a sudden snap it gave way, swinging loose in my hand. The wood shuddered as I pulled. The door creaked open by inches, releasing a gush of stale, suffocating air that struck me like a physical force. It reeked of rot, damp earth, and something else. Something sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The smell of old blood. I recoiled, gagging, my torch beam wavering violently. Beyond the door, the light revealed only a narrow slit of space, a crawl of blackness that seemed to drink in the glow rather than reflect it. The boards beneath my boots groaned louder, as though warning me not to continue. And then, from within that dark slit, something moved. Not a shape, not clear. Just the faintest ripple in the shadows, like fabric shifting or flesh stirring after too long in stillness. My breath faltered, and for a heartbeat I swore the darkness exhaled again, carrying that same suffocating weight of a presence unseen. The door yawned wider as though pulled by invisible hands, the wood straining, the hinges squealing. Something waited inside. The hidden door gaped open like a wound in the attic wall, its stale breath spilling into the room until the air felt too thick to draw. I wanted to slam it shut, to bury it again beneath the weight of boxes and dust, but some force stronger than reason kept me rooted to the spot. My torchlight trembled over the darkness beyond, and the shadows drank it greedily, retreating only an inch at a time as if reluctant to let me see what lay inside. I forced myself closer. The gap revealed not a second attic but a crawlspace, narrow and suffocating, lined with beams that leaned inward as though they longed to collapse. The air carried that same copper tang, the scent of old blood woven into dust and damp wood. My hand shook as I raised the light higher, and that was when I heard it. A whisper, so faint it could have been the trick of the beams shifting, or the breath of wind sneaking through rotten gaps. But no, it carried tone, rhythm, words too soft to understand, slipping just beyond the edge of clarity. I froze, leaning closer in spite of every warning screaming through me. The sound brushed against my ear, delicate and deliberate, as though spoken not into the air but into the wood itself. The beams above groaned, a low moan that shivered through the narrow space. More whispers followed, multiplying. They seemed to crawl along the wooden supports, spreading like veins through the structure of the attic. Wherever I pointed the torch, the sound slithered just out of reach, as though the wood itself carried voices that refused to be cornered. I pressed my hand against one of the beams. The moment my skin touched it, the whispers surged louder. A dozen voices overlapping, their tones desperate, pleading, some weeping, others angry, all pouring through the wood into my bones. I yanked my hand back in terror, but the whispers clung, echoing inside my skull long after contact had broken. The crawlspace beckoned, its mouth open, its air quivering with sound. Against all sense, I lowered myself to the floor and peered in. The torch's glow revealed carvings scratched into the beams, Crude shapes gouged deep into the wood. Some were nothing more than jagged lines, but others took form. Eyes, faces, twisted expressions etched by hands that must have trembled. Over and over, one symbol repeated, a spiral that narrowed to a single black dot at its center. The whispers surged again, drawn to my gaze. They seemed to chant now, the spiral etched into every word, pulling my attention toward the darkness deeper inside. My body resisted, but my mind leaned forward, curious in spite of the terror swelling in my chest. It felt as though the house itself urged me to crawl further, to press my body into the suffocating gap and follow the voices to their source. I shuffled an inch inside, the wood closing in around me, the dust clawing at my throat. The torch beam struck another beam ahead, its carvings fresher, as though added not long ago. The spiral there was sharper, deeper, almost alive in the way it caught the light. And then I heard it, clear and undeniable. A single voice rising above the rest, whispering not to the beams, not to the house, but directly to me, spoke my name. The sound was soft, intimate, as though the wood itself had leaned down to breathe it against my ear. My heart pounded so violently that the torch shook in my grip, scattering light across the walls. The voice repeated my name again, slower this time, lingering on each syllable as if savoring them. I pulled myself back in panic, scrambling from the crawl space until I stumbled upright, gasping for air that no longer felt my own. The whispers did not stop. They rattled in the beams above, around me, beneath me, filling the entire attic with a dreadful chorus. And beneath them, that lone voice persisted. It knew me. It had always known me. The attic had become alive with whispers, the wooden beams carrying voices as though they were hollow pipes filled with restless breath. No matter how tightly I clenched my hands over my ears, the sound seeped through, vibrating against my skull. That one voice, low, deliberate, and unervingly familiar, continued to call my name with patient insistence. It was no longer asking, no longer reaching. It was commanding. I staggered backwards, trying to flee to the safety of the ladder, but something made me stop. The torchlight, in its restless quiver, caught movement. Not scurrying vermin, not the restless sway of dust, but a form. At first it was only a suggestion, a darker shadow in a place already thick with them. But as my torch lingered, the shape became undeniable. It stood at the far corner of the attic, just beyond the reach of the hidden crawlspace door. It was tall, far taller than a man should be, its outline distorted by the sloping beams. I told myself it was the clutter, the stacked boxes and warped timbers merging into the illusion of something standing. But then it shifted. The shadow did not flicker like the others when my light passed over it. It leaned forward, slow and purposeful, as though its body was made not of substance but of the dark itself. My throat closed. The air between us thickened, vibrating faintly as though charged with invisible current. It had form, yet it had no face. Its edges were wrong, blurring, tapering to angles that no human frame could hold. Still, it was upright, unmistakably watching, and the longer I stared, the more my mind insisted it was waiting. The whispers surged, louder, faster, overlapping in frantic chorus, and my torch sputtered as though it too was strangled by the sound. Dust fell from the rafters, shaken loose by vibrations that had no source. In the shifting glow, I saw the shape tilt its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. My body betrayed me then. Instead of fleeing, I took a step closer, drawn like a moth to a flame that promised nothing but ruin. Each pace forward dragged dread deeper into my chest, but I could not resist. It was as though the voice calling my name from the beams had wrapped itself around my will, tugging me toward the figure. When I raised the torch higher, I saw its arms. Too long, too thin. They hung almost to the floor, ending not in hands but in tapering points, shapes that twitched with restless motion. And as the light brushed its chest, I realized it was not empty. There were markings across it, spirals carved deep, the same endless spiral I had seen etched into the beams. But these were not carved into wood. They were gouged into whatever passed for its flesh. The attic groaned underfoot, the beams bending slightly as though the structure itself bowed beneath the creature's weight. My name thundered again, not whispered this time but spoken with force that rattled the air. The figure stirred, shifting one arm forward, the sharpened point scraping against the floorboard with a long, splintering screech. I stumbled back, heart hammering, breath caught in my throat. But even as fear screamed at me to run, something else gripped me. Curiosity, hunger, or perhaps the very will of the house. My torch flickered wildly, threatening to plunge me into darkness altogether. And then it moved. Not a lurch, not a shuffle, but a fluid, deliberate step, closer, toward me. The attic tilted with the weight of its advance, dust tumbling in great clouds as the beams strained. Its faceless head bent lower, angling, studying me as though deciding whether I was prey or something more. The torchlight sputtered once, twice, and then caught on its surface just long enough for me to glimpse what should not exist. The spiral etched into its chest writhed. It shifted and twisted, not drawn, not carved, but alive, pulling itself inward toward a center that had no end. The spiral was moving, and it was drawing me with it, tugging at my vision until the rest of the attic blurred into nothing. I blinked furiously, tore my gaze away, and stumbled against the boxes piled near the crawl space. The torch slipped from my hand, clattering against the floor and spinning until its beams struck the corner once more. The shape was gone, but the whispers remained, louder than ever, vibrating with triumph. The attic swallowed the silence as soon as the figure vanished, but the relief was worse than its presence. The air felt hollow, emptied, as though something vast had stepped out of sight but had not truly left. The whispers continued, winding through the beams above, but now they carried a different tone. Less pleading, less furious. They sounded almost expectant, as though waiting for me to notice something I had overlooked. My torch lay on the floor where I had dropped it, its weak beam stretching across boxes long ignored. I forced myself to crawl toward it, the boards creaking beneath my weight as if protesting every inch. My hands trembled as I snatched it up, desperate for light. But when the beam steadied, it revealed something that stopped me cold. A box had shifted in the chaos, slid open just enough to spill its contents across the dust. Among the yellowed pages, splintered wood, and forgotten fabric, a single photograph lay face up. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable. A faded black and white portrait, edges curled and cracked with age. But as I leaned closer, the torchlight revealed the details, and dread gnawed at my stomach. The photograph was taken in this very attic. I recognized the slope of the beams, the angle of the ceiling, even the placement of boxes that looked identical to those still stacked around me. And in the center of the picture stood a family of 4. A man, a woman, and 2 children, all dressed in stiff, outdated clothes, their faces pale under the harsh exposure. Yet their eyes unsettled me. None of them looked at the camera. Instead, every single one of their heads tilted slightly upward, gazing toward the beams overhead, where the shadows gathered thickest. My breath came shallow. It was not merely a family portrait. It was a moment captured in worship or in fear. And then I noticed the markings. Subtle, faint, almost missed in the faded print. But there, scratched into the wall behind them, was the spiral. The same spiral I had seen carved into the beams. The same that writhed on the chest of the thing that had stood before me. I turned the photograph over with shaking fingers, hoping for an explanation. A date, a name scrawled in pen. There was writing, but it made my skin crawl. In uneven hand, as though etched by someone in haste, were the words, "It lives above us." The torchlight flickered, the beams groaned, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the family from the photograph not in faded paper, but standing in the corner of the attic itself, pale and waiting, their heads still tilted toward the ceiling as though frozen in devotion. I blinked hard, and the corner was empty again. The photograph trembled in my grip, the paper far too warm, as though it had absorbed the touch of many hands before mine. I shoved it back into the box, desperate to be rid of it, but no sooner had I let it fall than the whispers surged louder, crowding the air with urgency. They no longer called my name. Instead, they chanted in unison, the same phrase over and over, threading through the beams until the words bled into my bones. Look up. The attic darkened, the torch beam suddenly weak, swallowed by shadow. I did not want to obey, but my neck lifted of its own accord, as though tethered by strings pulled tight. Above me the beams shifted, and in the cracks where the wood met the roof something moved. The ceiling above me stirred as though the house itself had awakened from some long, uneasy sleep. The beams flexed, groaning with the sound of wood under immense strain. Yet the weight pressing down did not feel structural. It felt alive. Dust poured from the rafters, cascading like a storm of ash, and beneath it came a sound that froze me where I crouched. It was a slow, rhythmic pull of air, a long inhale that rattled through the wood, followed by a deep exhale that shook the floorboards under my knees. The attic was breathing. At first, the breath came steady, as though the house had fallen into some nightmarish slumber. But then, with each inhale, the shadows thickened. They pooled in the corners, climbed up the boxes, and swelled across the ceiling until it was no longer what I saw, but a black surface that seemed to pulse in time with the breath. The whispers that had haunted me since my first step into this place quieted, hushed as though bowing to something greater. In their silence, I realized the truth. The house had not simply contained a presence. It was the presence. Every beam, every wall, every corner of this place was part of something vast, ancient, and hungering. My torch flickered, useless against the swelling dark. The photograph still lay where I had dropped it, its edges curling against the floor, but now the family within seemed to move. Their faces had tilted further, their mouths parted in silent cries, their eyes wide not with worship but with terror. Another inhale, this one stronger. My lungs tightened, not with fear but with pressure, as though the house itself was stealing the air I was meant to breathe. I clutched my chest, gasping, but every breath I took felt hollow, already stolen before it reached me. Then came the exhale. It carried with it a stench so foul, so ancient, that bile rose in my throat. It was the reek of rot sealed away for centuries, of earth long undisturbed, of graves unearthed in secret. The foul wind pressed against my face, tangling my hair, filling the attic with a choking presence that made my eyes water. And with it came movement. The shadows at the corners no longer stayed fixed. They stretched, lengthened, reaching like hands dragging themselves across the floor. The spiral carved into the beams above glowed faintly, not with light but with depth, as though the wood had split into a hole that had no bottom. My name boomed again. Not whispered this time, not chanted, but thundered from every beam and board. It shook the very structure, rattling nails loose, sending boxes toppling in a thunder of collapsing clutter. I stumbled backward toward the ladder, but the floor shifted under my weight, buckling as though lungs rose beneath it. The board swelled and fell in rhythm with the breath, trapping me in its body, a prisoner swallowed whole by the living attic. The spiral above twisted faster, spinning like a whirlpool in the ceiling, dragging the shadows toward it. They clung to the walls, the floor, even to me, pulling at my limbs with invisible force. My fingers locked around the torch, the only thing tethering me to reality, but its light sputtered violently as though the attic sought to devour that too. Another inhale. This one did not stop. The darkness surged forward, swallowing the boxes, the beams, the walls, until all that remained was me, standing alone in a void that breathed. My legs trembled, my chest burned, and still the spiral above churned, pulling everything into its endless mouth. And then, from within the black, I heard it again. That low, deliberate voice that had haunted me since the first night. "The bargain," it said. The air rushed in, stealing the last of my breath. The attic fell silent, and for a moment I thought the breath had stopped. No inhale, no exhale, just a heavy stillness that pressed on my skull until my thoughts felt like they might burst apart. The spiral above had slowed, but it did not vanish. It lingered, steady and deliberate, as though holding its breath along with me, waiting for something to come. The shadows gathered at its center, tightening, condensing into a shape that should not have been possible. At first, it was a smear of black, liquid yet solid, writhing as though resisting form. Then, piece by piece, it shaped itself into something I could understand, though every instinct in me wished I did not. Arms stretched where no joints belonged, bending and folding like broken branches reknitted by unseen hands. Its body was long, too long, stitched together from shifting fragments of night that never settled in place. But the head, oh, the head was unmistakably human. Not in flesh, not in warmth, but in expression. It wore a face that might once have belonged to someone living, only now it was stretched thin, pulled too wide, the features warped into a mask of mockery. And then I understood the whispers, the photograph, the family. They had not lived with something above them. They had become part of it. The house had devoured their bodies and worn their likeness like clothes. And now it had found me. The voice rose again, no longer whispering, no longer thundering, but speaking clearly, directly, as though crouching inside my skull. The bargain, it repeated. Yours or theirs. The spiral pulsed, and the attic shuddered. For an instant, I saw their faces, those of the family, emerge in the shifting dark. Not photographs now, but pale, hollow-eyed forms staring out at me. Begging, pleading, their mouths opening and closing with no sound. I stumbled back, choking, my hand clutching the ladder, though it no longer felt like an escape. The attic had become infinite, stretching into black corridors that could never be walked. The ladder was a mockery of safety, just another rib in the body of the house. The thing leaned closer, its breath a cold wind that cut through me, its eyes two hollow pits glowing faintly with the spiral's endless pull. Yours or theirs. The meaning sank into me like ice. It did not want words. It did not want prayers. It wanted life, surrender of flesh or surrender of blood, not mine. And in that moment, the attic waited. It would wait forever if it must, because time here was not measured by clocks but by fear, and fear never ran dry. I do not remember deciding. I do not remember moving. Only the sound of wood groaning as the attic exhaled, the shadows closing in, and the spiral opening like a wound in the ceiling above me. The last thing I saw was the photograph, curling in the dust. But the faces in it were gone. Only one face remained.
Mine.